In the first chapter of One Piece, Luffy was said to have eaten the Gum Gum fruit, but over 1000 chapters and 25 real-life years later, this was revealed to be a lie, where in the biggest twist in the manga, we learned that Luffy had in fact eaten the fruit of a rubber god. Yet the chapter where this was revealed also held a second twist a lot of fans overlooked. On the same page where the 5 elders explain everything about the sun god Nika fruit, they also reveal something incredible about the One Piece world itself, which is that Zoan Devil Fruits actually have a will of their own. The elders speculate that this could even be the reason why the world government for centuries failed to capture the Nika fruit, where the fruit itself might have been evading them. While this twist about Zoan fruits may not at first seem as grand as the twist about Luffy having the powers of a god, the idea of the Nika fruit having a will of its own genuinely puts the entire story in a new perspective. What this could mean is that when Shanks originally stole this fruit from the government, this might not have even been Shanks' own doing. As crazy as it may sound, the Nika fruit itself could have willed for it to fall into Shanks' hands. The machinations of Luffy's Devil Fruit in the story could however go even deeper than this. Immediately after he stole the fruit, Shanks sailed to Luffy's home island, but in another overlooked detail, Shanks and his crew decided to stay there for an entire year. I do not actually think that Shanks ever planned to give this fruit to Luffy, or to anyone else for that matter, but the real reason why he stayed so long in the Goa Kingdom could be that Shanks was waiting for the fruit itself to decide who would be the next Joy Boy. The quote that Zoan fruits have a will of their own is very vague, but while it's hard to determine just how independent these devil fruits genuinely are, what seems very likely is that Zoan fruits choose their users. This is because it is not just Luffy, but there are several cases in the manga of characters miraculously ending up with Zoan Devil Fruits that are almost perfect for them. One example of this is actually Kaku. Once he arrived at Enies lobby, Spandam decided to grant Kaku a Devil Fruit, but none of the agents actually knew what powers this fruit contained, including Kaku himself. But it turned out that this was actually a Zoan fruit that turned its user into a giraffe. Yet this was shockingly the perfect fruit for someone like Kaku. Kaku was actually someone who had always loved giraffes, but what this actually resulted in was Kaku being able to unlock the full potential of his Devil Fruit faster than any other character in One Piece. Within just a day of him getting these abilities, Kaku actually showed far better mastery of his fruit than we'd seen from most other Devil Fruit users in the story, despite these characters having had their powers for years. Kaku was so suited for these powers that after the time skip, he even successfully awakened his fruit. This was genuinely an insane feat. Not only has every other awakened user in One Piece had their fruit for a far longer time than Kaku, but Zoan fruits are also noted to be especially hard to awaken, where for example, you can look at the Impel Down Jailer beasts that show what a failed Zoan awakening looks like. This genuinely makes Kaku a prodigy among prodigies, where almost no one among the hundreds of Devil Fruit users has mastered their fruits as fast as him. But it could be that Kaku ending up with a fruit he was so good at using was no coincidence. Just like with Luffy, Kaku getting a Zoan fruit that was a near perfect fit for him may have in truth been the fruit's plan from the start. Somehow, the giraffe fruit itself may have willed for Kaku to become its user, but the idea of Zoan fruits actually manipulating the events of the story, however, goes far beyond just Kaku and Luffy. I would argue that Luffy is in fact not even the only Straw Hat pirate this has happened to, where the other Zoan user of the crew was very likely also chosen by their fruit. Chopper eating the basic human fruit when he was young could in many ways have been seen more as a curse than as a blessing. When Dr. Kureha tells Nami about Chopper's past, she says that the fruit turned Chopper into someone who was seen as a monster that was shunned by his own race. But a very interesting detail about Chopper's backstory is that Kureha also revealed that Chopper had already been seen as a freak even before he became a Devil Fruit user. Because Chopper had been born with a blue nose, he had actually always been mistreated by the other reindeer of his herd, long before he even ate the human fruit. One way to look at this is that if this Devil Fruit chose Chopper as its user, it ultimately was the thing that saved him. Even though becoming a Devil Fruit user caused the other reindeer to cast Chopper out, he was never a true member of their herd to begin with. Yet because this fruit gave Chopper the ability to talk to humans, it actually allowed him to find people who for the first time treated him as family. But I think the example that best proves how choosy Zoan Devil Fruits can be about their users is actually the Azure Dragon Fruit. This is because this fruit went through a genuine journey, of it several times almost ending up with a different user, until through a series of happenstances, it was finally eaten by Kaido. At first, the Azure Dragon Fruit was in possession of the Celestial Dragons, as a prize to be given away to whoever performed well in the native hunting competition. When the God Valley incident however started, the fruit was stolen by Ivankov, who wanted to use it to escape the island with the other slaves and civilians. But then the fruit was in turn stolen by Big Mom, who herself wanted to give it to Katakuri to make her own crew more powerful, until finally Kaido stole this fruit from Big Mom and ended up becoming its actual user. Genuinely no other fruit in the story has gone through as many possible users as the Azure Dragon Fruit. Oda even noted how entertaining this idea was to him by throwing Ivankov as a possible user of the fruit in one of the SPS. While the idea of the Azure Dragon Fruit itself being the one that manipulated this entire chain of events sounds absolutely crazy, what I think a lot of you can agree on is that out of all the candidates, Kaido was by far the character this fruit would have most wanted as its user. The Celestial Dragons are pampered nobles who spend their days living in luxury. Ivankov is a well-meaning champion of the people. Katakuri only wants to live in peace and to protect his family. Yet by comparison, Kaido is a brute who's known nothing but violence ever since he was born. And unlike any of the other characters I just mentioned, Kaido is also a genuine warmonger, always looking for more fights. It is very easy to see why the Azure Dragon Fruit would see Kaido as its desired user, where more than any of the others, Kaido could and would use these Devil Fruit powers to their full destructive potential. In light of all of these examples, these could genuinely be a real thing that happens in the One Piece world, where somehow, some way, the Zoan Fruits actually manage to manipulate events in a way where they end up with their desired user. But this is where I return to the real idea of this video, where the Nika Fruit was not only always looking for the next Joy Boy, but that Shanks actually knew that this was the case. I'd next like to go over what I think could be the true backstory of One Piece Chapter 1, where Shanks, after stealing this fruit, decided to stay an entire year on Luffy's home island. A recent chapter of One Piece has revealed that Shanks 2 years before the events of Chapter 1 had learned that Roger before his death had sired a son. When Shanks was visiting Elbaf, Kaban not only told Shanks about Ace's existence, but also that he'd learned of this from Garp. Shanks got immediately excited by this news. As Roger had been very much like a father to Shanks, Shanks essentially saw Ace as his surrogate brother. This scene may have all but confirmed one of the most popular fan theories regarding Shanks, where ever since the Wano arc revealed the truth about Luffy's fruit, there has been a ton of fan speculation that the reason Shanks had come to Luffy's island was actually not for Luffy, but so that Shanks could give the Nika Devil Fruit to Ace. With this new information, however, the events line up almost too perfectly, where this theory might even be seen as guaranteed. Shanks learned of Ace just a year before he stole the Nika Fruit and sailed to the Goa Kingdom. This chapter also gives Shanks a perfect reason to go look for Ace in this particular country, as Kaban basically revealed to Shanks that Garp was the one taking care of Ace. As the Goa Kingdom is Garp's very own homeland, it would naturally be the first place Shanks would go to if he wanted to find Ace. Shanks in this chapter is also not only incredibly interested in meeting Ace, but what is also very noteworthy is that he even gets excited at the idea of Ace possibly becoming the next Pirate King. While he didn't actually say it in this scene, I think that Shanks also very likely saw Ace as one of the top candidates to be the next Joy Boy. For some context, even though Shanks himself never went to Laugh Tale, it is still incredibly likely that he knew about Joy Boy and the fact that he was going to be reborn in the current era. This is because, funnily enough, the manga has actually revealed that Roger was a bit of a blabbermouth after coming back from the final island. Once he'd completed his journey, we see Roger openly talking about the next Joy Boy not having been born yet. But on top of this, Roger even says that the next Joy Boy could even end up being his unborn son. As Roger talked so freely about all of this, Shanks may well have just overheard this information from him. Even if this wasn't the case, however, there is actually another very likely way Shanks could have learned about Joy Boy. When Shanks visited Elbaf 14 years ago, I think he during this visit could very well have gone to the Owl Library. This library is where Sol took all of Ohara's knowledge about the Void Century, and this is also where Vegapunk later learned everything he revealed in his Egghead broadcast. Even if the Roger Pirates had kept Shanks in the dark, if Shanks actually visited this library, just like Vegapunk, he could have by himself read all of Ohara's knowledge on both Joy Boy and the Nika Fruit. The idea that Shanks knew the truth about Luffy's fruit, I think is very likely, as at the end of Wano, Shanks is shown looking at Luffy's new Gear 5 bounty poster, with this very knowing look on his face, which to me is strikingly different from Shanks' previous reactions to Luffy's bounty increases. To piece all of this together, Shanks 14 years ago likely had all of the information to know that the Gomu Gomu no Mi was in truth the sun god Nika fruit, but also that there somewhere in the world was a child who was destined to be its next user. But on top of all of this, we now know that Shanks had also learned that Roger had fathered a secret son, and that this child was likely to be found in the Goa Kingdom. Looking at all of this from Shanks' perspective, I think it makes perfect sense that after leaving Elbaf, Shanks decided to seek out the Nika fruit and planned to take it to Ace, whom Shanks may well have seen as the obvious candidate to be the next Joy Boy. Except that there's one problem with this theory. This is the fact that the story has actually revealed that Ace during his childhood never met Shanks. Right at the start of Marineford, the manga shows a flashback scene of Ace as a pirate meeting Shanks, where Ace wants to thank him for saving Luffy's life. But in this scene, Ace says that this is his first time ever meeting him. So, what actually happened all those years ago in the Goa Kingdom? Why did Shanks, despite him having all of this information, and despite him staying a whole year on the same island, never actually meet Ace? Before I answer this, I think this is a good spot to remind you to subscribe to the channel, since because you've watched this video this far, it probably means that you will also like my other content. Personally, I really don't think that Shanks couldn't simply find Ace. This is because the manga has shown that someone like Kuma with far less clues was able to easily find Luffy on this same island in a single visit. Essentially, if Kuma was able to do this, someone as capable as Shanks, with an entire pirate crew at his disposal, would have surely been able to find Ace within a year. But what I think actually happened is that after coming to the island, Shanks deliberately chose not to look for Ace. This is where I once again finally return to the core idea of this video, which is that Shanks was not actually the true mastermind behind the events of Chapter 1, but it was instead the Nika fruit itself. One very interesting detail about the prophecy of Joy Boy being reborn is that no one actually knew who the next Joy Boy was going to be. The only thing Roger himself had learned was that the next Joy Boy was someone who had not yet been born by the time he himself found the One Piece. What this means is that even if Shanks would have thought that Ace could well be the next Joy Boy, and even if he had wanted this to be the case, Shanks should have also known that this was not a certainty. If Shanks also knew that the Nika fruit had its own will, Shanks may have also realized that this wasn't his choice to make. After he had stolen it from the government, and after he had sailed to the island where Roger's son was likely to be hiding, Shanks may very well have thought that his job was done, where the fruit, not him, would decide who its user was going to be. This is actually a huge part about Shanks as a person, where he very much respects the freedom of others and allows people the room to make their own decisions. Rather recently in the manga, we see that Shanks during his Holy Land mission decided to help Fisher Tiger and the other slaves to escape. This was a decision that went completely against Shanks' own interests, as it risked his entire cover with the Celestial Dragons, yet Shanks did it anyway. I think this is just because this is who Shanks is, where he always wants other people to have the room to choose their own fates. This is probably most prominently seen in how Shanks treats the next generation of pirates. Even though Shanks wants the One Piece for himself, he also thinks that everyone else should at least be given a fair shot at the treasure. The reason why Shanks at Wano interfered with Green Bull was actually not because Shanks was against Green Bull taking advantage of Luffy and company being wounded. Shanks himself says that he thinks there's nothing wrong with Green Bull fighting dirty, but the reason why he interfered was because he thought Green Bull was robbing the next generation from their chance at greatness. We saw the same thing happen before Shanks' own fight with Kid, where he deliberately asks his crew if Kid is wounded before their fight, and Shanks only thinks it's okay to face him after hearing that Kid looks to be at full strength. We also see this in one of the latest chapters, where Shanks is genuinely happy at the idea of Roger's son getting his shot at becoming the next pirate king. I would however argue that this is also how Shanks has always been, and that this is behavior we've seen since chapter 1. Even though Shanks clearly wants Luffy to become a pirate, he throughout this chapter is constantly pushing Luffy to find his own way, instead of just having Luffy settle by becoming one of the red-hair pirates. I think the reason why Shanks wants for others to walk their own path is because this is behavior he probably adopted from the Roger pirates. Roger and his crew were not only the ones who originally gave Shanks his own chance at a better life, but the story has many times shown that just like Shanks, Roger's crew very much wants others to make their own decisions and to come to their own answers. This is also seemingly behavior Luffy himself adopted from Shanks, where just like him, Luffy at many points in the story very deliberately allows other people to decide what they want to do. Even though it's not an actual person, I think it makes a lot of sense that this is also how Shanks chose to act with the Nika fruit. Instead of Shanks forcing this destiny onto anyone, I think he just did what he's always done, where Shanks came to the Goa Kingdom and decided to stay an entire year there, because he wanted to see if the Nika fruit would choose Ace. Naturally, we all know what actually happened, where it was actually Luffy who was the next Joy Boy. Shanks too may well have already become convinced that it was actually Luffy and not Ace. Even though Shanks in this chapter acts shocked when he learns that Luffy had eaten the fruit, he was likely just pretending. The most recent One Piece chapters have on top of everything else revealed that Shanks is actually a brilliant actor. This is in my opinion another thing that is very much present in chapter 1, where the entire chapter is full of moments where Shanks is messing with Luffy and telling him that he can't be a pirate. Even though we know that Shanks in truth adores Luffy, the idea that Shanks only came to the Goa Kingdom to give the Nika fruit a chance to find its true user is seemingly backed up by what Shanks himself says in chapter 1. At the very beginning of the chapter, Shanks says that he will finally leave this island for good after 2 or 3 more voyages. Yet by the end of the chapter, Shanks has decided to leave, even without these extra journeys. Even Luffy knows how sudden this decision is, but as we know, the big change that happened on this day that likely caused Shanks to change his mind was Luffy eating his devil fruit. Now, a very important thing that I think I should note in all of this is that none of this means that Shanks is lying when he says that he himself wants the One Piece. Even though Shanks really likes the idea of Ace or Luffy possibly becoming the next Pirate King, I think what this really means is that Shanks simply wants to compete with the next generation over the title. All the prophecies about One Piece's final war pretty much begin and end with these great figures coming together and fighting over the One Piece, but no prophecy actually says who the winner will be. This is even something deliberately noted in Vegapunk's message, where he says that this was something even Joy Boy himself did not know. What Shanks seemingly wants is the thing I've repeated a lot in this video, where he wants for the next Joy Boy and all these other next generation figures to be given a fair shot in this final war, but once the race is on, Shanks will still do everything in his power to win. I still have one last thing I want to talk about in this video though, which is how Shanks actually personally feels about Ace. Even though Ace thought that they had never met, I think it is still possible that just like what Kuma did with Luffy, Shanks during his year in the Goa Kingdom secretly observed Ace. But this could also explain why Shanks decided to back off and never introduce himself, even though he saw Ace as his brother. We know that Ace in his early childhood actually went around asking random strangers how they'd react if they found out that Gold Roger had had a son. The people would always say that this child was basically the son of the devil and someone who should have never even been born. This led to Ace developing a complex where he not only hated Roger, but Ace even saw himself as the son of a demon with no purpose in life. If Shanks discovered that this is how Ace felt about himself and Roger, it could well explain why he kept his distance from him. Even though Roger is someone that Shanks personally loves, he could well have realized that meeting Ace in this fragile period and telling him about his father would have done more harm than good. Shanks at this point in the timeline has just had to spend a considerable amount of time with his own biological father, who is also someone Shanks likely never wished to be related to, so he has first-hand experience of how touchy of a subject this can be to a person. It could even be that the big idea of this video is actually wrong, where Shanks did actually want to give the Nika fruit to Ace, but that this was the real thing that stopped him. If Shanks learned how Ace viewed his father, he very likely did not want to push Roger's ambitions onto him. If this is in fact the truth, Shanks deciding to stay a year in the Goa Kingdom could actually have a very mundane reason, where Shanks might have just been stumped and using this time to come up with his next move. Shanks possibly discovering that Ace wanted nothing to do with Roger is honestly very sad from Shanks' perspective. Shanks on Elbaf was so excited at the idea of having another brother, but I'd imagine that a big part of the reason why he was so happy was because Shanks has just spent a lot of time with his biological family, whom Shanks very likely did not like. But instead of him pushing these expectations onto Ace, Shanks as usual probably chose to do the right thing over his personal desires. I think this is also something we actually saw when Shanks and Ace met years later, where Shanks seemingly kept all his thoughts about viewing Ace as his brother to himself. I also have a strong inkling that Shanks throughout the story may have actually been very protective over Ace. For the longest time, I thought that a lot of Shanks' actions in the series were done just to keep the world stable, whether it's him meeting Whitebeard or entering the Summit War, but it could actually be that Shanks always had a personal angle in all of these decisions. While he clearly cares about the world's stability, Shanks could have actually done a lot of his actions for the sake of Ace. When he met Whitebeard, Shanks' only request was for him to stop Ace from going after Blackbeard. As Shanks knew that Ace wasn't ready for him, Shanks not only stopped Kaido from going to Marineford and making things worse, but he then personally rushed to the island after the fact. Even after he'd learned that Ace was dead, Shanks also made sure that his body was taken care of, and even attended his funeral. Shanks was still likely thinking about the bigger picture in all of these scenes, but now that we know how he viewed Ace, I definitely think that there was a bit of a caring older brother angle in all of these moments. None of this is too surprising, as Shanks is essentially one of the most good-hearted characters in the entire series. Even though there for years have been a lot of theories about him secretly being an evil person, the story has honestly shown that this is impossible, and the proof is in actually one of the scenes I just went over. If you're interested, you should click here to watch another one of my videos, where I break down how this single page of Shanks attending Ace and Whitebeard's funeral definitively confirms that Shanks is not an evil person. Thank you to all my members for the support. I hope you all have had a great holiday. I really appreciate everyone who watched all the way to the end.